What's going on, everyone? And welcome to another episode of Writing Friction. And as always, today's guest is pretty cool. Everyone say hello to Zak Salih. How are you, Zach?
Good, good. How are you?
Not
Thank
too
you for
bad.
having me.
The cat was just bouncing around. Is the cat on the floor or in the
The
lab?
cat is on the floor. The dog is downstairs on the couch. I'd rather have the dog in my lap than the cat, but what
Didn't
can
know
you
there
do?
was a dog and a cat. Boy, girls, what are their names? We care
The
about pets
cat
on this show.
is originally my boyfriend's.
Uh-huh.
And her name is Janet,
Mm-hmm.
and the cat downstairs is mine. At least in terms of how we divide the vet bills.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
gets the
yeah.
cat.
Of
I get the
course. Tell
dog.
me about it.
The dog is Susan, and she's
Okay.
a Basset Lab mix. And yeah, she just kind of sleeps all day. In that regard, she's like a writer. She just sits and pretends to work.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. I like the pretend aspect to it. So did you grow up with pets? Were you always kind of a pet guy?
I did. We were a huge dog family.
Yeah.
We got our first dog in 1997. It was a border collie. My parents have a dog. My sister has a dog.
Yeah.
So dogs are just the perfect animal for me.
This is the dog I grew up with. I don't know if people can see, but that's my dog Jack. The sunglasses, that's his face. I own a dog walking business. Dogs are a big thing in my life.
I love dogs. I'm shamefully not as committed to get a tattoo of my dog on me yet.
I have a lot of it. It's a lot. So for people who know, follow him on Instagram. It's the Leisure Bandit. He does these 80s style dog tattoos. I mean, they are, the dopest things ever. But
it seems like everyone is having Instagram feeds for their pets, and shamefully I don't yet. I feel like I need to capitalize that. And it's funny, actually yesterday I went for a walk at night, and this lost cat followed me home. And so I posted a picture on our neighborhood Facebook page, and of course the cat was found and claimed in like 20 minutes. But then the owner said, I said, this is a beautiful cat. And the owner said, yeah, you should follow it on Instagram.
Exactly.
So now I am following this random neighborhood cat on Instagram.
Absolutely crazy. But you said the word capitalize. I mean, there are people who are making some money off dogs with like tongues that just permanently hang out of their faces, and and it's just, the dog's probably like, fucking kill me now.
Yeah, right? I'm blissfully unaware. I have to remind myself that dogs are not as aware of things as we are.
1,000%. This is not a dog podcast, but the last thing I'll say,
it's going to be.
Well, the last thing I'll say about it is when I got Reba, a friend of mine, I grew up with dogs, but this is my first puppy. And she was just like, she has cats, and she's like, the crazy difference between cats and dogs, kittens and puppies is just like, kittens want nothing to do with you, and puppies want to eat everything that can kill them. Like, that's the big dogs will do everything. If you leave them be, they will do anything. They'll jump out the window. They'll eat. And I mean,
and this dog is I mean, she's a hound, so and we have people who litter in our neighborhood, so she just will pick up anything and everything. One time she dove into a pile of leaves outside our street and came out with half a baguette in her mouth. So it's it's just crazy.
So let's go back to the beginning. These dogs you grew up with. This was in Northern Virginia, right?
It was in Northern Virginia. I've been in the DC area my entire life. I've been living in the city itself. I think I moved here in 2000, end of 2008, I think, right on the heels of when Obama came into office.
Into the city proper.
Into the city, and it was it was a big to do. I had a very irrational fear that now that Obama was in Washington D.C., it would be impossible to get an apartment. But yeah, so I've lived in the city my whole life. I lived closer to downtown. Now I live a little bit in the northeast quadrant of the city, so over by Catholic University. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the city, but it's a little bit more kind of suburban than kind of right downtown, which is where I spent maybe the first 6-7 years of my time here in DC.
Yeah, I've been to DC a couple of times. I've been touring in bands. I played a couple of shows in DC. I've done like a couple.
Where did you play at?
Oh, I mean, this is way back. This is, coffee houses and club shows. Gotcha. Probably I moved to SF in 2011. So this is the last time I was in DC was probably 2000, right when you moved there, 2008.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, but it was always on school trips and things like that. I want to go back at some point and kind of just dig my heels into it and really living there. I mean, we're just, meeting for the first time. Does that city influence who you are? Are you into politics? Do you kind of have to be by proxy?
I don't think so. I mean, that's the myth about people who live in DC, is that we're all, obsessed with politics. We're all politicos, and there are certainly plenty of them to be found, and certainly some of them are my friends. I particularly am not. I'm kind of a connoisseur in the sense that maybe you are and everyone else is. Like I'm hyper vigilant about the news. But I have friends who can name every damn representative, and it's as arcane to me as kids in my youth who used to know all these baseball statistics.
Sure, yeah.
Where do you get the brain space for all this? So I wouldn't say. I think it certainly influenced my life in the same way that I think living in any major city, whether it's DC or San Francisco, can shape someone. Usually for the better. I feel like it turns out. It certainly exposes you to things that you couldn't get in suburbia. Although I'm not. I don't know. I don't. I think suburbia gets a bad rap sometimes. I think there's a lot to unpack there, but I don't think suburbia is the hell that a lot of people make it out to be. But yeah, I basically, so to answer your question, I have no real interest in politics or in incorporating politics into my fiction. And that was actually kind of I had a list of things I wanted to tick off when writing this book. And I wanted to write a book set in Washington, DC, in which none of the major characters either, worked for a political administration or, had any kind of overt political leanings. Because I mean, there are so many of us here who are teachers and doctors, and there's so many other professions out here other than just working in the government.
Yeah, no, definitely, without a doubt. And it's interesting that you wrote specifically steering away from that. I mean, again, like you said, do you think if you were writing about something in DC that it would almost have to be around politics? I mean, were you conscious of getting away from that as much as possible?
I mean, my concerns were overtly in this book.
And tell people what's the name of the book?
It's called Let's Get Back to the Party. Yeah. It's my debut novel, and basically the log line is it takes place in Washington, D.C. in between 2015 and 2016, and it follows the intersecting lives of these two estranged childhood friends as they kind of navigate their kind of their standing and their kind of the way they belong in terms of like a past and future of gay culture, which is constantly changing now more so than ever.
Yeah.
So what was I saying? So I knew I wanted to write about that, and there are certainly plenty of queer people who work in politics. I think more than might surprise some conservatives.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And we probably shouldn't go there. I think my publisher would get mad. But yeah, I wanted. I didn't really have interest in writing about politics, and part of it is because I don't have a kind of detailed interest in it, and I did want to write about people who live and breathe and work in this city, and maybe don't even know who their representative is.
Yeah, no, most definitely. I mean, obviously, I live in San Francisco, right? I mean, I live a mile away from the Castro. Living in this culture, within the the gay community here. I mean, everyone I know is either gay or kind of straight. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of always like that.
Well, it's also, I mean, it's also fluid, right?
That would be the right word. Again, your vernacular to this is a little bit probably more detailed than mine. I agree.
Be careful. I don't want to set myself up as some representative.
No worries. But yeah, fluidity would be the right word. In DC, I mean, were you writing about that? What's the culture like there in that city around the gay culture?
Yeah, I'm hesitant to make any kind of blanket statements because I think in all communities it's so diverse, and there are the cliches and the things you joke about, which are rooted in a kind of truth, that gay men here are very upwardly mobile and concerned with status and career And I think that's true. And I think that's also, that's also false. I've been, for lack of a better term, a quote unquote practicing homosexual for the last 15 years. And in my experience, I think, dating in DC, I think you come across the gamut. But it was a way for me to kind of, even though this novel isn't autobiographical, it was a way for me to kind of ground myself
Sure.
in experiences and in an environment that I had some kind of working knowledge of, perhaps less than others, but nevertheless, it was kind of it was a little bit of a firm footing, I think.
I mean, in writing this book, do you think you were writing for a specific audience, or were you really writing for yourself?
I was writing for myself. I don't know how some of the other writers you've interviewed feel about this, but I'm a big proponent of writing the story that you want to write and telling the story that you want to tell in the way you want to tell it. The
Depends
reason
what author we're talking to.
I'm sorry.
It depends what author we're talking to.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And we all have our own experiences and approaches, but to me, I mean, the idea of a readership is so subjective that I sometimes think the only real sense of objectivity a writer can have is their own taste and instinct. And it also depends, right? If you're writing to write, if you're writing to publish, there are other things you kind of have to keep in mind. But none of that stuff to me is integral to, at least writing some working drafts of something. That has to be, you purely have to write that for yourself. You can, because the minute you start taking so many other people's, opinions and tastes, you're just going to freeze up.
Have you always had that mentality back even when you were younger, when you first started writing, where you kind of just, I'm going to do my own thing, not really worry about?
No, therapy and medication have brought me to
what it is. We all have, trust me.
No, it's definitely something that I've acquired in the years that I've devoted myself to writing fiction, which is relatively recently, and we can talk about that at some point. But it's, I say this to you, and it's of course we all have terrible days, right, where it's like, oh, like, why am I writing this if no one's going to read it? But you have to kind of constantly remind yourself that you're doing this because it's almost like a conversation with yourself, at least at the beginning, when you're drafting something. Like, everyone else should kind of be out of the room. It's a very solitary experience, both physically and I think even kind of mentally too.
Going back, going back, I mean, when you were first, you said you're relatively new to writing. Well, first off, how new? And was this manuscript the first thing you wrote?
Yeah, so I should clarify that. I'm relatively new to fiction writing. I have been writing all throughout my professional career. So I'm a marketing and advertising copywriter.
Okay.
I've been doing that full time. I did that full time ever since I got out of grad school. And then 4 years ago at the winter of 2017, I left my job to freelance and then to devote my time to actually working on my fiction, which is something that I had been, putting off for years and years and years, mostly just out of a fear of actually undertaking it. I mean, in some regards, for me at least, for my journey, the process of kind of, quote unquote, coming out as a writer, as someone who wants to write fiction, was really kind of as charged as me coming out as a gay man. Like, there was so much buildup. There were so many years of just doubt and fear. And then once you kind of, I remember when I finally came to terms with my sexuality, I came out to everyone in the space of a couple months, because I just wanted to get it over with. I kind of wanted to start my life. And so it was the same thing with this. I had been just kind of debating and waffling about writing fiction for so long, that I really just decided at a certain point, I'm going to leave my job and try to do this. And, expecting, I'm a pessimist, so expecting the worst, but at least realizing that, I could go to my grave saying, at least I tried.
Sure. I mean, I can relate, coming out as an author. I've never, no one's ever said that to me. And it's interesting.
Yeah.
I guess I recently came out of the closet as an author as well, because
Yeah.
my whole life has been around music. I've been
Mhm.
playing in bands forever.
Yeah.
And 2 years ago, I started writing. I didn't really say anything to anybody, but I've been
Mhm.
reading my whole life. And I'm like, I feel like if I tell people, like, they're going to be like, well, dude, you've been playing guitar since you're 10, now you're 30. Like, what do you, who do you think you are, or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and when I got my first book published like 3 weeks before the world shut down. And then that was when people were like, you write? And I'm like, I guess, I don't know. Like, don't, maybe,
Yes, yes.
like,
Well, because yeah, I would have never called myself a writer, even though I made and still make a living, writing. But
sure, yeah.
there's something kind of unfortunately shameful about admitting that you write fiction. And I don't know if that's like the burden of capitalism, like writing fiction is just something that doesn't pay.
Sure.
It's not necessarily productive. So it's it's kind of like admitting you masturbate. It's just like, well, what good is it doing? Like
Yeah,
there's
unless you're on OnlyFans, unless you're making money from it, who gives a shit?
right.
Yeah.
And most of us are not. God bless the few that are, but most of us are not. And that kind of shame, in the same way that there for me was kind of a shame of being gay, that took a lot to get over it, and it still does. I mean, even when I was drafting this the novel, I would hang out with friends or go out places and meet people, and they would ask that inevitable DC question, what do you do? And I would say, oh, I write advertising and marketing copy. And my boyfriend would interject and say, oh, he's also writing a novel. It was the secret thing that I just
Sure, yeah, yeah,
did
yeah.
not admit, even though I had left my job to do it. There was something scary about just succinctly saying, I'm a writer. And
Yeah.
that's something that I'm learning to do more and more, is when people ask me what I do, just say I'm a writer, and leave it at that.
It's interesting. It's almost, yeah. I mean, I feel like it's the opposite in the sense of, like, you always have that classic idea of, like, the person moving to LA to be the actor, but they're waiting on the side. And they just
Yeah.
want people to ask them, what do you do? So they can tell people they're an actor.
Yeah. Whereas I just dreaded it. I just don't
Exactly.
ask you what I do. I'm going to give you some long answer with all these different qualifiers,
Yeah. Yeah. And I
dodge
mean,
around the fact that I'm at home writing fiction.
1000%. Like, people ask me now, like, what do I do? And I tell them in this order. I say, I own a dog walking business. I'm a
Mhm.
business owner. I host a podcast, and
Yeah.
I kind of write. Like, writing's the last thing I tell people I do.
Do you think that your, not to interview you, but do you think that your goal is to eventually get to a place where you would say writer first and then business owner and then
Oh,
music?
sure. I mean, yeah, I am, for people who are well aware of the podcast now. You don't know. I'm at the very, very end of my first novel.
Okay.
Done. Like, yeah, the book I released was a novella,
Okay.
a boxing novella in Jersey City. But
Okay.
I'm finished with my first novel, and I started this podcast really is kind of like, I've been working on this manuscript for 3 years, and I started the podcast like 5 months ago to kind of just like put it into overdrive, give myself the confidence by talking to other authors and having these conversations
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
like, because I didn't, I didn't go the traditional route. I didn't go to, the colleges. I didn't get the MFAs. I didn't do any of that. I'm coming from the total back end of this.
Yeah. Same
So
here.
there's a lot of insecurity within myself going into this world.
Mm-hmm.
That said, now that I'm at the very, very end of this book and it's done, I see it, it's about to go to my editor. I still would never tell people I'm a writer now.
Really, even though you've had a published novella and you have an editor that you send work to.
Yes. Yeah. It depends. If I'm on a Tinder date, yeah, I'll tell her I'm a writer.
Okay.
But no, my friends know. My friends, they know what's up.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. When I was younger, I would, again, it was the actor thing. I couldn't wait to tell people that I was a touring musician,
Yeah.
even though I was making no money. The fact that I had like that pedigree, people, they treated you a little differently and whatever. But
Mhm.
yeah, no, I don't know. I don't know.
I wonder why there. I see. To me, I wonder why it seems much more, for lack of a better term, kind of credible that someone would say, "Oh, I'm a musician." I feel like a lot of people wouldn't question that in the same way you said you would say like, "I'm a writer."
Sure.
I
Yeah.
feel like in the hierarchy of arts, like it's okay to be a musician. It's okay to admit you're a musician,
And a
but
failing musician.
when you're starting out to say like I'm a writer, it's like, oh,
Yeah. Yeah,
are
well,
you?
maybe that's how media's kind of portrayed it over the years.
Yeah,
Some authors have talked about on the podcast, like the idea of this author who's just like, I think Mark Lehner was on recently, and he was like, most people think of the author of like sitting there thinking and then writing it down,
yeah.
thinking, and, and it's like, I can't do that. I'm
No,
writing.
I don't think
I
most.
write when I'm doing the laundry. I'm writing as I'm cleaning up dog shit out of my dog's crate. I mean, like, it's always happening. But to answer your question with the musician thing, it's a tangible thing. People can go on Spotify. They can hear my music immediately. They can go on
Yeah,
YouTube. They can see me performing. They can go to a club to come see me. But as an author, unless your book is on a shelf,
yeah, yeah, and it's very daunting, and I think that's why a lot of people give up. I certainly felt that way at various points throughout this journey. You
yeah,
kind of don't have any tangible evidence for your own productivity other than what's inside your head.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it
And
really it speaks a lot to about what our culture thinks of as productive work and what isn't productive work.
yeah, and you being a debut novelist, obviously, you're just coming into this right now. How are you feeling going in? I mean, are you going around town letting people know, my fucking book's coming out, I'm an author? How do what
It's
was the process like for you? What is it like for you right now?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because you would think that since I have a career in marketing and advertising, that I'd be so good at marketing and advertising my own book.
You said it.
But no, I freely admit it. And thankfully the kind folks at Algonquin have people who are helping me in this regard, because otherwise I think I would just be kind of sitting in a room and like biting my nails,
Yeah, yeah,
waiting for anything to happen.
yeah,
Um, but it and again, not to well, yeah, no, to again, to liken it to coming out, you have to put yourself out in the world, right? You have to display your authentic self, even with all the vulnerability that comes with that. So I've kind of put on a shameless self-promotion hat, and I just cross my fingers and hope that my friends and everyone know that he's trying to sell a book, like he's
yeah.
not full of himself. And most people get that.
How long did it take you to write the book?
So I mean, the physical act of writing started in January of 2017 when I left my job,
Okay,
um,
yeah.
to build a freelance career, and then also to basically devote most of my time to writing this novel. By November of that year, I was sending a draft out to agents, and in between that time, I mean, I had probably maybe gone through 2 or 3 drafts, some on my own, some after giving it to some readers, some people I trust,
Okay.
for their feedback. But by November, um, it was in decent enough shape that I felt comfortable sending it out to an agent. That process then took maybe like 4 or 5 months of rejections, in the middle of which I don't want to say completely rewrote, but I definitely sat down and so the way I work is I print something out and then I retype it, and in retyping it I kind of
Fascinating. This is.
that's just
I'm so happy you say that because uh, if I tell that to another author, they might say that's fucking insane. And like
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
like yeah, like Elliot Ackerman, we had him on, and I'm always going to use him as a reference because he says he does kind of the same thing. Every day he takes what he wrote and he rewrites it on a whole new document.
Yep, yep. um yeah, and why I do that, I think that's just how my mind works. I'm so envious of these writers who say that they write longhand. I don't think I have the wrist muscles to sustain that, and B, when I'm writing, my mind is just so hyperactive that it would be impossible for my hand to keep up with my thoughts. It's a lot easier for me to type, I guess. I feel like it typing something out in a Word document kind of closely approximates the speed at which my brain works.
Okay, fair enough.
Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, and it's just, I save the kind of handwritten edits for later on, like once the project is to a place where I'm comfortable with it and I like it, and the changes are minimal, then I'll print it out and mark it up and write things. But when it's like the first, 2 or 3 drafts, yeah, it's typing it up, printing it out, retyping it again, changing things along the way, printing it out, typing it again. And by that point, hopefully I'll have arrived at something that kind of approximates what I had originally intended.
Yeah. So after that first round of rejections, you said you worked on it for like 4 or 5 more months. You kind of moved things around. What was that process? I mean, what were you not happy with?
No, so I kind of was just sending it out for those 4 or 5 months, or let's say maybe 2 months. I was just sending it out to
Yeah.
different agents, finding agents who represented similar work,
Yeah.
doing that whole process. And then just midway, I think I had received so many rejections that I wasn't, I would never get real detailed rejections, so I wasn't sure what was wrong. Um, but I had spent enough time kind of not working on it and just sending it out that I felt it was okay to sit down and again I retyped the whole thing and kind of made some significant structural changes, or at least and also in some regard trying things out that I had maybe thought, oh, maybe this will make the book work. And then realizing in trying it out that no, it didn't really conform to the story that I wanted to tell.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, and then once that was done, I did another round of just sending it out and waiting. And yeah, I got from one agent, I just got just such an incredibly detailed and kind and generous, rejection with the offer to resubmit if I had made these changes. Now, ultimately, the changes he wanted to see, I had tried them and they just weren't working for me. So, but I remember that moment as thinking like, wow, like people are at least taking me seriously. Like that, like there's something, yeah, it was an incredibly thoughtful and polite, and not polite but also critical. I mean, you could tell this agent had taken it seriously and had given thought to it, and that in itself, the idea that a stranger who wasn't my family or who wasn't a friend, who had no obligations to me whatsoever, could take me seriously enough to give me that kind of detailed critique. That rejection really just kind of powered me through the next round of revisions that I did, and ultimately arrive at the novel that's going to be in people's hands.
So what was that the agent you would ultimately work with?
No, it was not. It was not. I found my agent, Kate Garrick at the Carpfinger Agency. I had submitted the book to her, I want to say in March of 2018.
Okay.
And she eventually wrote an email back saying she loved it and she wanted to talk, and then that was that, and we worked on a round of revisions together, and then sent it out, I think maybe a month or two later to publishers, and then the people at Algonquin Books saw something in it and picked it up, and then so I got my editor there, Betsy Glick, and we worked together on a couple rounds of revisions, and that and that was that.
Yeah, I mean, it's in, for the first book. I mean, at the end,
it sounds, I'm glossing over it. Like there were, believe me, there were plenty of moments of kind of frustration and crying jags. Like, so I don't want to create this idea that it was this, oh, it's as easy as just persevering. Believe me, there were plenty of times where I just thought, what did I do? I left this comfortable job for this, just to write a silly book about, gay men. Like when we have so many other brilliant gay writers already working, like what,
well, some of them aren't working. Some of them are just on Instagram. Yeah. Anyways, yeah, it's interesting because I'm, to turn the camera on me for just a second. I'm at the point where I'm with my novel. I've been working on it for 2.5 years. I'm either gonna send it to the editor, spend the money, work on it again, send it out, or I'm going to take my laptop, go to the Golden Gate Bridge, and jump off with my laptop attached to me. I don't know where I'm at right now, and every day it's a different thing. The insecurity is crippling me. But at the same time, like you said, the novella, I self-published the novella. It got rejected 73 times. I'm like, you know what? I wrote it. It's just a little fucking book. I want to see my book on a bookshelf. And I did it. And I'm happy I did that. This book, if it doesn't get published, I'm not going to self-publish it. I'll write another book. But the thing is, it's so in me right now that the idea of even just putting it out there, it's crippling me, to go through that next round of rejections. I mean, it's fucking brutal.
It is. I mean, I firmly believe that writing itself is absolutely hard, but I think what's even harder is just the psychological and emotional pressures of writing something and telling a story and wanting to share it with people. I mean, just kind of imagine how relatively easy the task would be if we just, didn't give a shit about things like, what are people going to think of this, or is this going to find a publisher, or, am I doing the right thing? It's such an emotionally fraught activity, career, sometimes that's why people give up. That's why, there are periods where I almost gave up, because it's not the writing the writing is hard, but I don't think it's the difficulty of the writing that makes people stop. I think it's all the kind of emotional and psychological pressures.
And I'm a big guy. You got to trust your gut. Like when I'm reading back, like my thing is like if I write, humorous, I write funny stuff. Like my writings, I try to be overtly humorous. And when I'm reading things back, if it makes me laugh, I don't even, just keep going. That's staying. Don't even think about it. So I'm trying to just trust the gut and go through it. And I feel like now this is a therapy session on my end, but it's not. Let's go back to you. So are you working on anything next? I mean, or do you work on simultaneous projects? What's up for you in the future?
I'm very single-minded. I'm like a dog digging a hole. Like I will not stop until, I've finished something. So, but that being said, this novel has technically been done for quite a while, just given the length of time that it takes to publish an actual physical book.
Yeah.
So I have been working on a couple projects, a new novel. I work on short stories in my downtime, so I'm gathering some of those together and seeing what might come from that. So it's nice to know that, kind of once this publicity aspect of it is maybe not over, but is certainly kind of dimmed down in the weeks after publication, that I won't be stuck with a blank computer screen. Like, I'll at least have something tangible.
Sure.
Just the physical presence of a manuscript to me is so comforting. I remember when I wrote that first draft, maybe in like two or 3 months, and I went to Staples and printed it out, and they put it in this box, and I came home and I took it out of the box and I just sat the maybe like 300 something pages on my table. And knowing that 70% of it was shit.
Oh yeah.
There was still nevertheless just something comforting about the accumulation of pages. I mean, going back to talking about, visible signs of productivity. I mean, just knowing that here was this physical object, and now that it was somewhat out of my head and in the world, it just immediately it still felt daunting, don't get me wrong, but in some way it felt a little more manageable. Like, oh, this is just a stack of pages, like with words on it. I can do something with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I had a similar experience with my novella when I finished it, and I sent it to my editor. I got back. I went to FedEx, Kinko's. It's also not cheap to print out that many pieces of paper.
Well, I guess it depends. So I print out every draft. I don't have a printer in my office, so I use it as an excuse to go out into the world to go to Staples.
Oh, you print every draft?
I do, yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Again, like just the accumulation of drafts make me feel like I'm doing something right. But yeah, I want to say it's like $38 to print black and
Yeah,
white.
it's
300
just
something
funny.
page.
It's just a funny thing to have to think about, you know.
Oh no, believe me, there are plenty of other things I would rather do with those $38. But
Yeah. All right. Well, Zach, this has been a blast, man. I always ask two questions at the end of these.
sure.
First off, you do social media, Twitter, Instagram, anything like
I
that?
do, yeah. My website is my name at zaksalih.com. You can find links to my Twitter profile. I tweet occasionally and responsibly, and I'm on Instagram too. So
Okay,
you can
great.
find it
And the
all
name
there.
of the book is Let's Get Back to the Party, correct?
Yes, yes.
And the last question I ask is, where are people going to buy your books from? What bookstores you like to rep?
Well, hopefully independent bookstores. And we're really blessed here in DC to have so many. And I'm certainly, I won't be able to name them all, but I'm thinking of, we have Loyalty Bookstore, we have Politics and Prose, we have Solid State Books and Kramer Books and Old Town Books in Old Town Alexandria. Capitol Hill Books. There are so many. It's such a great city it's a city of readers.
Yeah, for sure. Zach, this has been a
So
pleasure,
many.
man.
I'm sorry.
This has been a pleasure.
Oh, likewise. Thank you so much
Yeah, no, most
for having
definitely.
me. I enjoyed it.
Enjoy DC, and I'm sure we'll see each other again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you. Take care.
Without a doubt. Bye-bye.
Bye.
What's going on, everyone? And welcome to another episode of Writing Friction. And as always, today's guest is pretty cool. Everyone say hello to Daniel Gumbiner. How are you, Daniel?
I'm doing well. Glad to be here. Thanks
yeah, man, I love the smile. It seems like we're pretty stoked. You're over in Oakland. I'm in SF. This is probably the closest Zoom podcast I've done with someone in a geographical sense.
I know. Were it not for the pandemic.
Crazy, man. Crazy. I mean, and your book, The Boatbuilder, is pretty new. I mean, to kind of hop right into it. I mean, did this affect any events you kind of had going in with the book? Were you still kind of pushing the book along in that way?
No, it was pretty well after sort of when I had been doing most of the publicity and stuff around the book. So yeah, fortunately for me, I know it's real tough for folks who are having their first novels come out right now and trying to manage those kinds of campaigns, digital events and all that stuff. So yeah, I didn't have to really do any of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've talked about it ad nauseum, but my first book was released 3 weeks before the world shut down. So it's kind of like, I'm like, all right, let me just I'll start a podcast.
Yeah. Hey, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So where are you from originally? You're from Northern California, right?
Yeah, I'm from Marin County.
So what part of Marin? Where were you born and raised?
So I was born in San Francisco and grew up there, and then my family moved to Marin. We moved to Kentfield, which is right by the College of Marin. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
Near Fairfax.
Okay. Where in SF? Where in San Francisco is your family from?
Well, my family's not from there, but my parents both met out there, and we lived in a couple different apartments. We lived in Pack Heights, and we also lived in the Fillmore.
Oh, okay, cool. I'm over in Haight-Ashbury, but I moved here 9 years ago from Northern Jersey. But I was in Lower Haight for almost a decade.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I also lived in the city too. I lived in the Richmond for a while before I came to the East Bay.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, the Bay Area, man. I mean, being a dude, my family's from the Bronx. I was born in Queens, grew up where they filmed The Sopranos. So like moving to the Bay Area, I mean, for people who've never been here, I mean, it's hard to explain, but the vibe, it's so my vibe. You have to be in the vibe of the Bay Area to really, get the most out of it. So that being said, growing up, like, there's a lot of ways to grow up in the Bay Area. How were you? I mean, were you kind of like a kid, bombing hills on your skateboard, smoking weed? Were you kind of just, buttoned up in the library? What were you kind of like as a kid?
I went through a lot of different phases, I would say, but probably my biggest love as a child was basketball.
Oh,
pretty much from 7th grade on, I was really into basketball. So I devoted all of my time to sort of working on my skills and playing outdoors. And
are you a tall dude?
I'm like 6'2", so not tall.
Realistically,
Yeah, but not tall.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was, I was outside playing basketball a lot. That was one of my favorite things to do. But growing up in Marin too, there was just so much great like outdoors opportunities around. So I spent a lot of time hiking and hanging out in the woods and
Were your parents kind of like hippies? I mean, what brought them to the Bay?
They were. My mom definitely was. I don't know if I would describe my dad as directly as a hippie, but my mom definitely self-identifies as a hippie, and was a part of that whole movement out here. A little not in the 60s, but a little later in the 70s, and she lived on a beach in Hawaii and made jewelry.
Was she part of like the whole Dead scene? I mean, was she into the Grateful Dead? Was that part of her life?
She wasn't into the Dead as much. She was more into the Rolling Stones.
Okay, right on. Yeah.
Which she always had like a really strict, in her mind, there was a really strict line between fans of the Rolling Stones and fans of the Beatles, and like whatever way you went there was like a real determining factor. And as far as whose side you were on.
So was music being played in your house as a kid? Was music part of your childhood?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I wouldn't say it was a huge part of it, but definitely the kind of like influence of like hippie culture in a certain way. My mom had a CSA from the time we were very young and went to farmers markets, and so that was all stuff we kind of like grew up with.
I mean, I grew up in. Have you ever been to New York City?
I have, yeah.
Okay, so
my mom's actually from New York. She's from Long Island.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So like growing up where I grew up, like there weren't farmers markets in northern New Jersey growing. I mean, it just wasn't a thing, right? So like when I moved to the Bay, like I saw this word and I'm like, what's a taqueria? Like a taqueria? And my friend's like, dude, it's a taqueria. That's where you get Mexican food. I'm like, what? And so no idea. So growing up in the Bay, what were you doing other than basketball? I mean, you're kind of hanging out. You said you're up in the Marin, hiking and stuff like that. Were you reading a lot? Were you writing a lot? I mean, what was any kind of creative stuff going on that early on?
Yeah. I was a fairly academic kid too. I would say definitely liked to read and got into writing relatively early, and there were a few sort of like formative young adult books that were really influenced me and made me feel like, particularly there was one book which was called Rats Saw God, which I haven't revisited in many years, but it was a book that really made me feel like I could write about my own life in a way, the sort of the life of just a everyday high school kid. And after I read that book, I wrote a sort of like a third of a novel.
Okay.
That was kind of like my first foray into writing. So I was into writing at the time at that young age, and was kind of was fascinated by the power of it, I think, and the kind of that sort of the magic of creating a world in that way. And the Rat Saw God was kind of the first book that made me think like, oh, this is something I could do with the pieces that are available to me.
Was that like a fantasy kind of novel, or was that more set in the real world?
It wasn't fantasy. It was actually it was very like classical young adult novel. It was about these high school kids. The main character is this kid who his dad is this famous astronaut, so he has all of this kind of like weight on him in terms of what he needs to live up to. But he's kind of like an offbeat kid who doesn't really fit in very well, and he meets these other kids and they form this club that's about them creating Dadaist art projects in Texas.
Got it. Okay.
So it's kind of it's sort of just like a coming of age story, really.
I mean, was it the kind of thing where you read it and you're like, oh, well, someone did this, I can do this too? Or was it kind of like, oh, someone did this, it made me feel this way, I want to try to make people feel that way as well?
Yeah, it's interesting how that works. How sometimes you see a great work and you're like, this is like, it's like the light that illuminates, or the light that obscures. Like sometimes you see someone's book and you're just like, that is so good, I should just stop writing. I could never write anything of that caliber. And then you see someone else's book and you're like, that is so good, and it makes me feel like I could also produce something similar to it. I think it was more the latter. It made me feel like, oh, this is something that like, with the material that's surrounding with my own personal experience, I could do something with this. Mm-hmm. So it was definitely it was an inspiring thing to read as a young person.
Yeah. So high school, going into college, I mean, were you at that point, did you want to be a writer? Was that the dream? Was it on the back burner? I mean, what were your goals at that age?
Yeah, I think it was always floating around as something that I was interested in. I mean, in college, I definitely entertained a lot of different possibilities for.
Were your parents encouraging of it?
I think so. Yeah, my mom was always encouraging of it. I mean, I think she picked up pretty early on that I had a real interest in it. And so I think she kind of encouraged me in that sense, and sort of knew early on that it had been something that had drawn my attention. But they, my parents were not very forceful in any direction. They sort of wanted me to figure out what I wanted. They're hippies. they wanted me. Yeah, they wanted me to do.
I have one hippie parent. My father is not a hippie.
Yeah, so I tried out a few different things. It was always kind of like a part of my academic experience, I would say. Like I was always taking English classes and writing classes.
So you were taking writing classes.
English. Yeah. And I ended up majoring in English. And then pretty much when I got out of school, I started working in publishing almost immediately. So then I was kind of like into the work world of.
What was that? So what was that? I mean, what was that? Were you doing an internship? I mean, was it kind of just they were hiring and you wanted the job?
Yeah. So I had done this thing in high school that was called the Best American Non-Required Reading, which was this class that used to be taught at McSweeney's by Dave Eggers, and it was a group of high school students from around the Bay Area who would meet at McSweeney's in the basement of McSweeney's. And they would read through everything that was published in a given year, all the different literary journals, like the Kenyon Review and Jubilat and Conjunctions and all that stuff. And
this is what year? What year is this?
This was my senior year in high school.
So, I mean, for people who don't know, I mean, Dave Eggers is a big part of San Francisco, the Bay Area. I mean, he's been involved that long. I mean, I've known about him since 2010.
Yeah.
Okay. That's
yeah.
Awesome.
Dave has been. Yeah. I don't know what year exactly he created 826 Valencia, but this was sort of connected to 826 Valencia, which is his writing nonprofit, now a national series of nonprofits. But we would meet in the basement at McSweeney's, and we would kind of like talk through the different stuff we had read. And at the end of the year, we would pick 25 pieces that were then published by Houghton Mifflin in this anthology. And so I became familiar with McSweeney's through that experience, really. And kind of, when you would walk in to go to Best American, you would walk down this kind of like gauntlet of desks where all the McSweeney's editors were working. And I would sort of like see them and generally like knew who they were. And so when I got out of college, I went back to McSweeney's and did an internship with them, and had picked up a couple of other jobs in the meantime, and piecing together, a paycheck and stuff. And eventually a job opened up to be the managing editor of Best American Non-Required. Okay. There was always a managing editor that helped out that project. And so then that's how I sort of like stepped into working at McSweeney's, and then from there ended up becoming associate editor and then managing editor of the Quarterly.
So are you writing during that time? And if so, what are you writing?
I was writing some. I wrote a novel that I later abandoned, which
at this point, I'm going to start the podcast with that question. Every single author I've spoken with, abandoned their first novel. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I think it's a part of the work. It's a part of kind of like figuring out, kind of like getting out. I mean, I still feel that in myself in the process of writing currently, where I sort of like, every sort of section of a project that I'm working on, I kind of have to get out a section of it that's not working until I finally work my way to the section of it that's working.
Yeah.
I think it's a part of, I think it can be definitely, to me as a young writer, it was dispiriting because I thought like, oh, I can't do this. I can't get it right. And now the way I look at it more is sort of that, your job isn't really to get it right. Your job is to just kind of like sit down there and do the work, and whatever arises in the process of doing that is great. If it is successful, that's great. You get to keep it. If it's not successful, it just means it didn't come for you that time, but that, you're not responsible for the output so much as you are responsible for kind of just showing up. And so that was sort of like my first experience of writing, was feeling like not necessarily understanding that I needed to kind of like work through that first draft of stuff and get it out and keep going and continuing to follow my interest, really, because I think that's ultimately how you get through that process too, is to just like not let yourself get deterred and to just kind of like keep reorienting yourself toward the things that are of interest to you, and over time those layer and it becomes something that is a final thing.
And so during that time, I mean, what was your routine? Were you writing in the morning before work? Were you writing at night? Were you writing on the weekends? I mean, were you reading a lot? Were you working a lot? What were you kind of doing at that period?
Yeah, I would say all of the above. Yeah, writing in the mornings. That's still my process. I work for The Believer nonfiction magazine that actually used to be a part of McSweeney's and now is a part of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And so I have like a, day job working normal hours.
Did you go to college in Vegas?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, I only went down to Vegas because of the magazine.
Only? Okay.
Yeah. The magazine moved there in what was it, 2017.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you abandoned that first novel. You're kind of working full time. You said you're in the Bay Area, right? Living in the Bay Area can be a lot of.
At that time. Yeah.
You were in SF at that time. Oh, and what neighborhood? Where were you living in SF at that time?
I was in the Richmond.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, inner or outer?
Inner.
Okay, of course, we could talk SF all day for sure.
Right by USF, yeah.
Yeah, good. Well, right near Green Apple Books, obviously our favorite bookstore.
Yes.
All that good stuff. All right, cool. So you're living in SF. We probably crossed paths, didn't even know it. When did the idea for the Boatbuilder come to you, and also why that idea?
Well, I started writing the Boatbuilder later on. I had actually moved to the East Bay by then.
Okay. So what were you doing in between that time? Were you writing anything else, short stories, or were you kind of messing around with anything in SF?
I wasn't really. I don't think I was writing much during that time. I think I was mostly working, and at that time I was in that interim period. I was at McSweeney's, so I was doing a lot of stuff related to the quarterly and editing a few different books there while I was there. But yeah, I was in the East Bay, and I started taking this class with this boat builder named Bob Dar, who ran a school in Sausalito. It was a wooden boat building class, and Bob was from Marin like me, and had grown up actually splitting his time between Tahiti, where his father had a property, and where his father would run charters back and forth between Tahiti and Mill Valley, where Bob grew up.
Whoa.
And yeah, it was a pretty incredible childhood.
Yeah.
And we just became friends, and Bob was a really great storyteller, and I felt he sort of like connected me to a kind of, he had a way of describing Marin and the experience of the time when he worked in Marin that was really resonant to me, and felt like something that I hadn't heard described exactly, or the experience of that I hadn't really heard depicted in a certain way. And I thought, well, this could be, the setting for a book. The idea of a boat builder working in this kind of space, this kind of landscape. I mean, that's really, it started with the idea of the place more than it did the story. And so that was kind of the origin of the project. And then, it evolved and shape shifted a lot from there.
Well, yeah, I mean, so let's talk about that evolution, right? So yeah, you have a setting for a story, obviously, rich of characters and, just anyone who's walked through any, Muir Woods could talk, right? You could, I mean, where you live it's beautiful. So you have that setting. The story deals with drug addiction, correct? Specifically pain pills and things like that. Was that a personal experience? Someone you knew? I mean, growing up where I grew up, northern New Jersey, I mean, pain medication to this day is destroying those communities. I know I've been personally to shit, man, 6-7 funerals, all from prescription pain overdoses. So, it was something that I kind of, pick up on. We'll talk about that. Where did that story come from? What was the genesis of that?
Well, that was like fairly, connected to my own personal experience. I wasn't addicted to pain pills, but I did have a head injury and was prescribed painkillers and took them. And that's the thing about those painkillers that often gets kind of lost in the conversation, I think, is that they're really effective, especially if you're dealing with chronic pain. And that's why they are, as to a large extent, why they're as addictive as, obviously there's the element of chemical addiction, but I think there's, they're really effective and they help your pain. And it definitely helped me. And but I was also aware and anxious and concerned about the question of addiction. I knew about the dangers there. And so I think the story really grew out of that experience for myself of kind of like understanding a little bit of what it could be like and how it could how easily one could be susceptible to that kind of experience. And then also the question of kind of like confronting the experience of pain, which was chronic pain. And I mean, the book to me is really in large part a book about dealing with chronic pain, and sort of learning, through the process of boat building, how to allow the experience of pain to be there and not kind of like force yourself against it and create additional suffering in addition to the pain we experience, because obviously everyone experiences pain. That's a part of the human condition, but suffering is more this thing that we, generate by wanting things to be different than they are. And so that was kind of the story of the addiction and pain pills in many ways allowed me to tell that broader, more universal story of what it's like to be a person experiencing pain and confronting pain, and kind of like the nature and anatomy of what it feels like to be in pain.
Do you remember when that first sentence came to you?
Of the first chapter?
Yeah, I mean, do you remember that moment?
I do. I was in my, I don't remember I remember starting the project. I don't remember the exact date of when it happened, but I remember being in my room, starting the project. And I pretty much wrote that whole first chapter in one night.
And did you kind of, with the idea of just blasting it out, I mean, not really kind of editing, just kind of get it on the paper?
Yeah, I think I just felt that scene realizing itself, and then kind of like went from there.
So at that point, though, had you already had a process with your writing? Again, you said you like to write in the morning. And also, were you still working with that actual boat builder? Were you talking to him about the book?
I wasn't talking to him about the book. I didn't tell him that I had written the book until it was finished.
Why not?
That's a good question. I don't, I think I didn't want to disrupt the process of working on it. And I thought that might do that. And also kind of like make him maybe like self-aware of the, of being when he was around me.
Yeah.
But in retrospect, I think Bob's a very kind of adaptive and smart and kind of grounded person. So I don't think he would have been fazed by it. But it was really interesting, the experience of kind of like showing him the book and talking to him about the book, because obviously the character by that point had taken on dimensions that had nothing to do with his life, and by the end the story was really not his story in the way that the whatever origins, you know, Berg's character had in my own story was not my own story anymore. And that's kind of the interesting thing about fiction, right? Like it sort of like starts with you know, some seed, and then it develops into this other thing. But it was interesting to show him the project, and I think he enjoyed reading it. And actually one of the coolest events I did was this was definitely pre-pandemic. We did a interview and reading in his boat shop in Sausalito. So it was me and Colin Winnett, the author Colin Winnett came out, and we did a talk and reading in his boat shop. And it was a lot of the folks who are part of like the Sausalito boat community and part of Bob's community really came out, and that was a really special event.
So I mean, I had almost the exact same experience. So I wrote a boxing novella. I started boxing at 3rd Street Boxing Gym down in the Dog Patch about 3 or 4 years ago. And there was an old trainer there named Lenny. And he was, I mean, literally a character in a book. And I was training with him, and he just had, you know, like you could have put him in any Rocky movie in any era, he would have been perfect. Old grumpy cab driver, right? And I'm like, you know what? I was working with him, you know, things he would say during workouts, I'd write them down. I'm like, I need to write about this guy. I'm like, but I can't have it be so on the nose. So I'm Jewish. I grew up in, you know, a very Jewish part of the country in northern New Jersey. I'm like, let me take what I know, like Jewish people,
Yeah.
and let me take him. And so I took him in his boxing gym and put it in Jersey City and made him Jewish. And all I did was just change Lenny to Benny. But doing that, dude, was just enough to now a whole other universe opened up to me. And what started with this idea in my mind of like, let me write a story about Lenny initially. At the end of it had nothing, but then I gave him the book, and he had I never told him about it. And I gave him the book, man, and he looked at it. He was like, what the fuck is this? And I'm like, I wrote a book, and it's kind of about you, but not really. And he was like, he wasn't sure. And he took and he read it, and he liked, and yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, yeah, almost the exact same experience. That's really cool.
Yeah,
I mean, was he honored? Was he humbled by it?
You know, I think so. I think he probably, I don't know if he said those words specifically to me, but I think so. I think it's yeah, for me, that's definitely a big part of my writing process, is kind of like staying connected to something that's kind of like real and grounded in like my own actual experience, but then kind of like letting it expand and diverge where it needs to expand and diverge, which it sounds like it is exactly what you did too, kind of like putting it on your own playing field and kind of like giving yourself the conditions that you need, that it needs to grow adequately.
It's the same thing. What you said, I feel like if I had told him about it while I was writing it, it would have affected my process. He probably would have been thinking about it, right? He probably would have been like, hey, let me read some of it or something like that. It would have totally fucked up the whole process. So when the book came out, how did you get in? I mean, you were already working, you said, in the publishing field, the editing field. How did you get the book into the world? I mean, did you already have an agent? Were you sending it out? How did that happen?
Yeah, so I didn't have an agent. I was at that time I was actually not really working in publishing anymore. I had basically I was sort of like freelance editing, and then I was also working on this charter boat on the bay for this sailing company, which was also another thing that was kind of like ended up being like woven into the book in a, you know, different but somewhat similar way. So I was kind of like out of the writing world to a certain extent, but you know, was working or out of the publishing world, I should say, but I was writing. The book was, I sent it around to a bunch of people. There wasn't a lot of interest in it.
Just cold emails, just some agents you kind of found on the internet kind of thing? Or did you have some?
And some folks who I had known from, you know, just like working in publishing too. I ended up then sending it to a bunch of kind of like writer friends who I knew who were older. One of them being Dave Eggers, and he really liked the book and he wanted to help me, send it around. And so he helped out a bit with that, and also helped with edits on the book too.
Oh wow.
And there still wasn't a lot of interest in it. And Dave was like, well, let's just publish it with McSweeney's. And so that was kind of how that went down. The book came out with McSweeney's, and it was, a great experience in the sense that, all of the, there's so much more control when you're working with a small press in terms of like getting to weigh in on the cover and all of that kind of stuff. And and also just to have it come out with folks who in some cases were my former colleagues. That was a cool process too.
And the publishing industry, you could see some guitars and posters. I've been touring in bands since I was 13, 14 years old. And the publishing industry seems to be a lot like the music business. The record labels, the smaller the label, the more control you have. The larger the label, the more people who have their hands in the pot. So it kind of, I guess you kind of cemented that idea. So also it was part of the National Book Award process, right? Can you talk a little bit about that? How did that kind of happen?
That happened. You mean like, how did it, like,
that's my dog. They can't see it. Well, now they can. My dog is playing with the lights and it's flashing. To continue, they'll listen to you. Don't worry.
Wow, he's a light designer dog.
Yeah.
I was living in Vegas by that point. I had moved down to Vegas to work on the sort of like second life of The Believer, which was starting up down there. It was just a real surprise. I woke up one morning and had a bunch of texts from people. And
did you submit it yourself, or what did you have to submit it?
No, that they submitted. McSweeney submitted it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And checked Twitter and found out that it was on the long list. And it was a super exciting day. I was actually leaving the following day for Reno to go to their lit crawl. And so there was a party that night for the Black Mountain Institute, which is the broader organization that powers a bunch of different stuff, including now The Believer. And so went to that party that night and then woke up real early in the morning and just like jetted off to Reno, and it was all a bit of a blur during that period.
We talked to a couple of authors on the podcast, and some of them had, they freaked out. Some of them didn't really give a shit. I mean, did it affect the book sales? I mean, you get the little thing on the book. I mean, if that hadn't have happened, would you have cared either way? I mean, is it even something you think about in the next book?
Yeah, I mean, I think it felt great, to see it validated, especially because I think it, like I said, it had been a book that had been rejected a lot, probably like 30 times.
Yeah.
So to see it like come out and, get acknowledged like that was definitely like special and validating. But I think, definitely with that book, I just felt really good about it. Like when I finished it in a way that, it allowed me to sort of like have it be rejected 20 times and then still want to publish it. Which I think, so to a certain extent, I was kind of like, I just felt really good about it being out in the world. And I was glad when I heard that people read it, and glad to know that this was going to, hopefully mean that more people were going to read it. So I felt really good about it before that, but then that was also like a wonderful thing to have
that
happen.
rejection process, it was never something you wanted to give up on, right? You trusted you just wanted to continue push it through however you could.
Exactly. Yeah, I felt like I felt like I had done something that was representative of the kind of story I wanted to tell, and so I felt confident in that.
Yeah.
which, you know, in retrospect, looking back on it, it was, you know, it was a lot of rejection to confront in that sense.
I got rejected. I got 73 rejections. 73 rejections. Yeah. But see, I was an asshole about it. I learned the process the hard way. So I'm at the back end of finishing my first ever novel. I'm done telling the story that I want to tell. It's about a rock and roll band. And I'm gearing myself up for the next cycle of rejections to come my way. So that being said, I'm also working on 2 other books right now as well. Are you working on anything right now? Had you started a new idea beforehand? Yeah. What's your process like?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a huge part of the process, getting rejected, you know, and
of course.
It's important to, you know, every writer, I think, has to kind of like form their relationship with that experience. And you hear it a lot from writers who are, you know, super accomplished writers who talk, you know, say, you know, they still get rejected from 10 things a year, or like, you know, and it's relative to a certain extent. The context changes for like what constitutes rejection to you. But it's definitely like a huge part of the process, I think, always moving through. And that's one of the kind of like, I think, things that one of the skills of becoming a writer is kind of like figuring out how you deal with that, you know, and keep going forward. And I think so I always think it's like good to talk about it too, and to kind of like put it out on the table.
It's a theme. I think I'm going to get in the back behind my head on the podcast. We had Janet Fitch on. She, I guess now infamously said she was able to cover an entire wall with rejection letters of her apartment, like wallpaper. I was saying before. So, are you working on it and anything now, or had you started something previous while you were working on the Boatbuilder? I mean, what's your process?
Yeah, I'm working on a new project now. That's kind of definitely still in a sort of like, you know, I'm getting to the end of what I think is a first draft, really.
Okay.
Did you
do a lot of drafts for the Boatbuilder? How many drafts did you do for that?
I probably did. You know, it's interesting. It's hard to think about it in terms of drafts, because, you know, I read through each scene so many times. But I think probably in terms of like complete drafts that were reviewed by a different person, probably like 3.
Okay.
Yeah. But, you know, then in my process of writing is kind of like working through, I'm kind of like molding and smoothing stuff and generating more stuff, and then molding and smoothing that over and over again. I often go back really far into the first part of the story and begin reading through that. And I'll make tweaks along the way as I'm doing that. For kind of like rhythm, and, you know, maybe I realize that some other piece of information should be seeded earlier in the story or stuff like that.
Are you a big phone guy? Do you do voice memo notes when things kind of come in your head?
I write down notes. Yeah, I use the notes app, and
I wrote an entire short story in the notes. Huh?
I said it's not the most organized notebook, but, you know, it gets the job done.
I own a dog walking business here in San Francisco.
And really?
So I'm in the woods, dude, all day. And I mean, ideas, they're coming at me, and I have to. I mean, if people ever got a hold of my phone, I mean, it's of course it's all.
Yeah, that's what's going to be in your archives.
It's all a mishmash, man. It's all a mishmash. So did you have the idea for the new book a long time ago, or did you kind of wait to finish the first book and then?
I started working on this project about a year ago.
Okay.
And it's sort of when I moved back to the Bay Area.
Okay.
And it you know, broadly it sort of like deals with the experience of being between 2 instances of like wildfire. So kind of like the period after a wildfire and before another one.
A literal wildfire. Again, Northern California, we should, you know, with a prairie well, for sure. Interesting. Well, Daniel, we'll
sort of looking at that as like the new one of kind of like the now like defining features of being here to a certain extent, is kind of like knowing that cycle is going to be there, and kind of like live within that cycle.
it's like people told me when I moved to San Francisco, they're like, well, what about the earthquakes? It's like, well, yeah, you're right. Yeah, but then, I think we live in paradise, man. I think the Bay Area is one of the best places ever, man. It's the best.
Yeah.
Actually, Reba, the bulldog, is giving me the dead eye. Daniel, this was a blast, man. Thanks so much for taking the time. I asked a couple of kind of quick questions at the end. First question is, what bookstore do you rep? Where should they buy your books from?
Well, the bookstore that I really loved that just went out of business, unfortunately, was Wolfman. I also
was that in the East Bay?
Yeah, it was a great bookstore that was owned by Justin Carter, and they also produced a quarterly, which I loved, called the Life Quarterly. But other bookstores, East Bay Books is my neighborhood one, and then I also love Point Reyes Books up in Point Reyes Station, run by Molly and Steven Sparks.
Well, maybe you and I can open up a bookstore, Daniel.
That would be, and hey, we always need more bookstores.
I'm into it. And do you do social media? Can people get in touch with you? Any Twitter, Instagram, anything?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. It's just @D and then my last name, Gumbiner. Yeah.
Daniel, thanks so much, man.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, most definitely. Enjoy the rest of the beautiful evening we got.
Yeah, you too.
All right, later, dude.
All right.